Honorable Minister of Planning, Manan Shahib, DG, Director General of BIDS, Binayak, distinguished guests and friends. I'm very happy and honored to be here today to deliver the keynote address for BIDS's annual program, ABCD. I do not always have similar opportunities because, as most of you would know, I do not live in Dhaka on a lengthy basis. I do come and go from time to time. And this time it's to happen that my visit coincided with this program, and I had the opportunity to be able to say yes to Binayak that I would be happy to give a keynote speech if you want me to. Now, the theme of this conference, as you know, is development, freedom, and justice. This is also the title of my lecture. Now, when Binayak and his colleagues at BIDS decided to give this theme for this year's conference, there must have been a presumption that these three objects, development, justice, and freedom, they must be somewhere connected to each other. They are not just a random positioning of three different terms in one place. Now, it may not be obvious to some what that connection might be. If you think about it, development is commonly understood as a matter of people's economic condition, improvement in their material and economic standard of living. That's the common understanding of development. Justice is a matter of ethics, closely related to the notion of fairness and rights. To be just is to be fair to everyone and to respect everyone's rights. And finally, freedom, things like freedom of speech, freedom of expression, there are many kinds, but many of them seem to be mainly a political concept, though it does have ethical undertone as well. Thus, development seems to reside in the realm of economics, justice in the realm of ethics, and freedom in the realm of politics. Three different objects residing in three different realms. So one might justifiably wonder what's the connection between them and whether there is a connection at all. Taking a bit of liberty from a popular Bangla song, one might wonder, Tin bhuboner tin bashinda, bohe samantara. I shall present the case today against that view. I would say they do not run parallel to each other. In fact, their paths cross each other at many different points, so that each of them affects the others. And one of the consequences, this is what I'm going to argue, one of the consequences of those interactions is that each of them will remain seriously incomplete if not supported by the other two. If we wish to aim for any one of them, we must aim for all of them at the same time. Otherwise, we shall fall short in achieving our aim. Now, one important implication of this view, which is the one I'm going to focus on today, is that if we are trying to advance the cause of development, which most governments do, including our own, then we cannot ignore the demands of justice and freedom. This will be the main theme of my presentation today. Now, before going into the details of the argument, I'd like to clarify exactly what I mean, exactly what I'm claiming. When we say that while aiming for development, we cannot ignore justice and freedom, this statement can be interpreted in two slightly different ways, related but different. Now, the common element in both of these interpretations is that we shouldn't focus single mindedly on economic development. We should focus on justice and freedom as well. This is common to both interpretations. The difference lies is the reason. Why? Because why should we focus also on justice and freedom if we want to focus on development in the first place? In the first interpretation, this is because all three are highly valuable goals, highly valuable objects. In the second interpretation, the reason is unless we focus also on justice and freedom, we won't be able to achieve development itself. The first interpretation we might call the intrinsic interpretation. The second we might call the instrumental, and I also add constitutive interpretation. In the first interpretation, we do not take any position on whether the three are related to each other. We simply say that we love all three of them, so we want all three of them. In the second interpretation, we do take a position on the causal connection between them. I am saying that in the second interpretation, I am saying that justice and freedom significantly contribute to development. That's why if you want development, you should also want justice and freedom. Now, the difference between these two interpretations is not merely academic or philosophical difference. There is a very significant practical implication of this difference. If you adopt only the first interpretation, where we love them all, that's why we want them all, if that's the view, then someone might say, fine, very good, we want all of them, but in life you can't have everything at the same time, so we need to prioritize. And as developing poor nations, we want to prioritize development, and we'll take care of justice and freedom later. But if you adopt the second interpretation, you can't say that. Because the second interpretation is claiming that in order to achieve development itself, you need justice and freedom. You can't leave them for later. To see the point more clearly, think about other things, such as infrastructure, say, roads and bridges, which also support development. And if you are aware that infrastructure is needed as a support for development, you are never going to say that we shall prioritize development and think about infrastructure later. Exactly in the same way, if you accept my second interpretation, you won't say that we'll prioritize development now and think of justice and development later. If infrastructure supports development, so do justice and freedom. This is the thesis I want to defend today. It is the second instrumental interpretation of what I'm saying is the one that is my focus today. So I want to proceed as follows. First, I shall discuss some of the pathways through which justice supports development and injustice hinders development. Then I shall deal with freedom, some of the pathways through which freedom supports development and lack of freedom hinders development. And once I have discussed those causal connections, I'll try to draw some conclusions about an appropriate development strategy in the light of my discussion. So we begin with justice. A little bit of background first, so that we can get to the heart of the matter clearly. In the philosophical political literature, political science literature, ethical literature, justice has several connotations. Aristotle famously made a distinction between corrective justice and distributive justice. My concern today is the latter, distributive justice. But just to be clear, we need to understand this distinction. Corrective justice refers to basically the criminal justice system. If somebody is guilty of some offense, that person needs to be punished, penalized, but the punishment needs to be proportional to the crime. That's corrective justice. It's important, but it's not my concern today. My concern is with the other one, distributive justice. Now, distributive justice refers to justice in the distribution of valuable objects among people. The valuable objects could be material, like things people need, like food, healthcare, income. We need all of them, valuable objects. But they can also be intangible, non-material objects, like opportunities of various kinds and freedoms of various kinds. Opportunity to live the kind of life we want to live, opportunity to choose the occupation we want, occupation to choose our leaders in the government, to choose our system of government, all those opportunities and freedoms to pursue those opportunities. The distribution of them also falls under the concept of distributive justice. Now, Aristotle's own concept of distributive justice was a rather limited one, and as you can understand, old-fashioned one. He thought that distribution of valuable objects is just when they are distributed in proportion to merit. Now, in other words, the more deserving ones should get more proportionally. Now, how to measure deservingness? That depends on the nature of the object to be distributed. Without going into the details, the main point of it here is, in his argument and the argument of his contemporaries, there was no presumption in favor of treating everyone equally. The focus was on proportionality rather than equality. The modern idea that human beings must be treated as fundamentally equal to each other had not yet taken root at that time. It took a long time, more than 2 millennia, for that perspective to emerge. It did so in the most emphatic manner only in the 18th century, mainly through the works of the great philosopher Immanuel Kant. In modern times, scholars such as John Rawls, Amartya Sen, Martha Nussbaum, and others have carried this idea of justice on the basis of equality further, drawing out policy implications of this approach. In particular, thinking about what governments can do to ensure justice in this sense. They do not always agree on each other. But for our present purposes, we do not need to go into those finer details. What's important for our present purpose is that all of them base the philosophical case of distributive justice on a common premise. And that premise is that all human beings deserve to be treated equally because of their common humanity, regardless of their gender, race, ethnicity, language, any other attribute, doesn't matter. All are part of a common humanity, and that's precisely the reason why they must be treated equally. My immediate concern today, however, is not to defend this premise. I take it as given. My concern is with the economic consequences of deviating from this premise. if you do not treat everyone equally, it has not only ethical, moral implications, it has economic consequences. And I want to talk about those economic consequences mainly here. Now, there are many different channels through which justice can affect development. Presence of justice will affect positively. Absence of justice affects negatively. And many of these pathways have already been clarified and examined, mostly by economists, but others too. And I won't have the time to discuss all of the pathways, and there is no time to discuss them in great details, but I shall give some outlines of a few pathways that I consider extremely important. The first pathway looks at distribution of material resources. If these resources are distributed very unjustly, so that most of it is enjoyed by a small proportion of the population and the majority being deprived of their material resources, that injustice is not only bad in itself, but it's bad for economy too. One of the pathways through which this very unjust, unequal distribution of resources adversely affects economic performance, economist has identified as the channel as the concept of credit constraint. If you want to, as individuals, if we want to perform economic activities, whatever kind of activity you are undertaking, whichever sphere of life, we need to invest something. Either we have to invest in our health, invest in education so that we become productive people, or invest in physical investment so that we can improve our productivity. One way or the other, in order to improve our productivity, we need to invest in both physical and human resources. Very often, the investments may be worthwhile, but we may not have the money within myself to make those investments. That's why we borrow, go to the credit market to bridge the gap between what I need and what I have. The problem with unequal distribution of resources is that this inequality results in an asymmetry in the credit market. The rich people who have enough resources, very often they don't need any money. They have easy access to the credit market. But the poor people who don't have resources of their own, who really do need loans, they are left out of the formal sector credit market for reasons that I shall not go into. Most of the economists would know here that there are transaction cost problems, evaluation problems, for the reason of which banks think that poor borrowers are not worth bothering about, leave them alone. Which means that the poorer segments of the society, which is the larger segment of the society in most cases in the developing world, they are deprived of the opportunity to make the profitable investments which they think they are capable of making. Whether it is investment in their nutrition, whether it is investment in their education, or investment in physical capital to run an enterprise, to run a shop, to do a business. They cannot have enough access to the resources, which means they underinvest. They underinvest in their own nutrition, they underinvest in their education, they underinvest in physical capital, which means in turn that productivity does not reach the potential that they can. So we have a large swathe of human population in our unequal societies where people fail to realize their productivity potential. So you have labor force, but a bulk of the labor force are not as productive as they might be, which means our economic growth potential that we have, that potential is not fully realized. We may boast of 6%, 7%, whatever rate of growth, but the fact is that growth could have been higher if these people were able to fulfill their productivity potential, which they cannot do because of the credit constraint. And the credit constraint itself emerges mainly from unjust, unequal distribution of resources. Now, this important role that credit constraint plays in our failure to fulfill our productivity potential through various pathways has been discussed illuminatingly by many economists, including the latest Bengali Nobel laureate, Abhijit Banerjee. In many of his works, he has highlighted the importance of this credit constraint. So that's one pathway. The other pathway is gender injustice. I think Sajada here and others, Naila Kabir, others were going to discuss this particular phenomena. In our societies, apart from various economic reasons, for cultural, religious, and other reasons, women are in a disadvantageous position. A lot of the injustice that is done to women compared to men is so well known in our part of the world that I need not give you examples. But I want to tell you about some of the consequences of the injustice that is done to women. One manifestation of the injustice is that women cannot enter the labor force to the extent that they potentially could, which means a large portion of our potential labor force remain dormant. They are not there. So if you don't have the labor to work, where is the economic growth coming from? So part of the reason is the absence of labor force, because women do not have as many opportunities to enter into gainful opportunities as they can. Things are changing, things are improving. Women are increasingly entering the labor force, thankfully, in our country, but still a long way to go before women can enter the labor force as freely as men can. So long as this injustice persists, and one immediate problem is our labor force is not fully utilized, that holds back our economic development. More significantly and in a more subtle way, it not only hampers our development today, it hampers our development in the future. Women are the mothers. If mothers do not have education, it often turns out that children do not have enough education either. If mothers do not have the nutrition, it often turns out that children are more malnourished than others. So less educated, less nourished mothers give birth to less educated, less nourished children. And girls among them are typically suffer even more than the boys. So when these girls become mothers, this cycle then repeats itself. Undernourished, undereducated mothers give birth to undernourished, undereducated children. And this intergenerational transmission goes on, holding back the potential of labor force, not just today, but generation after generation. So one of the economic consequences of gender injustice is that not only we have underutilized labor force today, we also have underutilized labor force in the future who are not able to fulfill their full productivity potential. The third channel, third pathway through his justice and injustice affects economic performance is in the labor market, the labor rights, the rights of laborers to organize themselves for a better pay, for better working conditions. When these rights are violated, the labor cannot demand and obtain what they could reasonably ask for. It is not only that a justice has been done, injustice has been done to a particular group of the population whom we call, in our case, let us say garment workers, the latest example. But it affects the future performance of the economy. A labor force that has been denied its rights are an aggrieved labor force. An aggrieved labor force is one that lacks motivation, loyalty to their place of work. An absence of motivation, of loyalty, in turn diffuses their incentive to work as diligently, as motivatedly as they potentially could. This idea that if you do not treat the worker well, then you not only do an injustice to them, but also you demotivate them, and that has economic consequences, has been recognized in the economic literature since long ago in the theory of what we call efficiency wages. If you offer them better wages, if you offer them better working conditions, you are not just doing them favor, you are doing a favor to yourselves as employers, as the national leaders, because if you do that, they'll work harder, work better, everybody benefits. Now, it's an interesting story. There's an interesting story many of you could be aware of. Henry Ford, the pioneer of the capitalist mode of production in the factories, assembly mode of production, many years, over a century ago, understood instinctively the logic of this argument behind efficiency wages. At one stage, he decided to raise the wages of his workers by $5 a week. At that time, $5 a week was a lot of money. And most people wonder, well, what has happened to this old man? Has he suddenly become soft in his old age? What's the problem with him? He said, no, there's no problem. I'm making an investment. This $5 additional wage, I believe, will increase the productivity of labor so much that they will return me more than what I am giving them today. Now, in his lifetime, that was a conviction. It was not proved. But later on, economists with careful econometric study proved that was indeed the case. His $5 raise of wages benefited his General Motors company more than they benefited the workers themselves. So when I look at the labor rights, violation of labor rights in our country, I worry that these violations of rights, these injustices, are not only something that for which we feel sympathetic to the workers themselves, we feel sorry for them, but we're sorry for ourselves too, because we are losing out the benefit of their higher productivity. Finally, the final pathway I want to mention briefly is the link between justice and social stability. If people of a country perceive their society to be terribly unjust in many different ways, that perception itself, regardless of the reality, that perception itself can be a serious economic problem. If you perceive that society is very unjust, you become worried that this perception might lead to social grievance. Social grievance at some point erupts, like the Arab Spring, into very unstable political situation. So investors are very wary about this perception of widespread perception of injustice. Even before the instability occurs, the very fear, the very threat that injustice might lead to social instability deters investors from investing as much as they want. They hold back. Even have the money and the resources, they often hold back. Once again, the economy does not fulfill its full economic potential. So these are some of them, not all. These are some of the various pathways through which lack of justice hinders development and justice promotes development. Turning now to freedom. What is the relationship between freedom and development? Freedom has many different dimensions. Some are political, such as freedom of speech, freedom of expression, freedom from oppression, freedom from abuse of laws, freedom to choose the system of government, and to choose the people who will run the government, and so on. Some of the freedoms are socioeconomic. For example, the freedom to choose one's occupation, freedom from hunger and disease, freedom to live in the community with honor and dignity, and so on. All these freedoms are, of course, intrinsically valuable. They are valuable in their own right. We cherish them, we want to have them, we want to enjoy them. But they're also valuable for the sake of development. So they're not only intrinsically valuable, but they're also instrumentally valuable, and also a related concept is, I would say, they are constitutively valuable. So the relevance of freedom for the sake of development has two aspects. One is the constitutive aspect, and the other is the instrumental aspect. The constitutive aspect means that these freedoms are actually part of our conception of development. So they constitute what we mean development, these freedoms. And this particular idea that freedoms are constitutive of development has been championed most persuasively among many others by Amartya Sen. In his capability perspective to development, his whole point is the goal of development is to expand our capability to live the kind of life we want to live, to pursue the goals that we value. If we have the freedom and the ability to pursue the ends of life that we value, that's what development means. So freedom is constitutive of development. So if you want to pursue development, then by definition, you must pursue freedom as well. That's the constitutive aspect. But there is also the instrumental aspect, which means they're not only intrinsically valuable, they're not only constitutive of development, but they're also useful instruments for achieving the goal of development. And I want to illustrate this instrumental side of the relationship between freedom and development by giving a few examples. For example, if you think about freedom of speech and freedom of expression, freedom of information flow, those things are important for development for various reasons. One type of reason is based on the idea of what philosophers have called deliberative democracy and practical reasoning. Deliberative democracy, as the name implies, is that democracy is not just a process of choosing our people, our rulers into an election. Of course, election is important. Casting our vote is important. But what deliberative democracy says, that even if you are able to cast your votes in broad daylight rather than in the darkness of night, even if you are able to do that, that's not enough for democracy. Democracy is a process whereby we discuss with each other, we debate with each other, we deliberate in a public forum. That's why you call it public reasoning, about what is that we want, what is good for us, what is bad for us, and once we decide what is good for us, how can we go about achieving them? These discussions have to take place through a discussion of the people of the country together in a public forum. And that is important. Not only we want, that's our right, but also because that kind of deliberative democracy or public reasoning is useful for efficient policy making. Now, why is it useful for policy making? One answer was given by a 17th century philosopher Baruch Spinoza, a Dutch philosopher, who has been credited with being the first philosopher to provide the first cogent systematic defense of democracy. Before him, philosophers starting from Socrates, Aristotle, Plato, and others, they had an ambivalent attitude towards democracy. First of all, their understanding of democracy was slightly different from what we think of it today. And secondly, whatever the understanding was, their view was not always complimentary about democracy. But Spinoza, for the first time, gave it persuasive theoretical and conceptual justification of democracy. One of the arguments he presented was this particular one. He didn't use the term deliberative democracy and public reason, and these terms appear much later. But what he said captures the essence. Deliberative process was a good idea. And that's what he gave the following reason. Very few people would have the understanding of foreign and domestic affairs to judge wisely what is conducive to the common good. The great majority would therefore fall prey to persuasive orators who know how to make the worse appear to look better, appealing to the prejudices of people rather than to their reason. He was not very impressed with the people's ability to see the right thing. Interestingly, 1 century before Hobbes, another philosopher, who is Niccolo Machiavelli, had given an advance answer to Hobbes' proposition. He anticipated and gave an advance answer. His answer was this: a prince who is able to do what he wishes is apt to behave like a madman. Whereas a people which can do what he wishes is apt to act merely unwisely. So I think most of us would agree that being unwise occasionally is far better than being mad consistently. That's why we need freedom of expression, freedom of speech, freedom of information, not only for their own sake, but for sharing knowledge and ideas, arriving at the right conclusions so that our policy making in economic spheres, every sphere, is efficient. The other illustration I want to give is it is related to the idea of efficient policy making, but it goes beyond the idea of efficiency. It's a matter of recognition of what is important and what is not. Now, Amartya Sen, in his work on famine, many of you know, have made the point that independent democratic countries never experience a famine. Famine has happened in the world when either a country was ruled colonially by a foreign master, or they're independent, but they're despotic and totalitarian. And he made this point by comparing independent India with independent China. He said that in India, whatever the faults it has in terms of democracy, its faults have multiplied much more today than when Amartya Sen was writing 40 years ago. It has faults even then. But he said, whatever faults our democracy has, at least we have the freedom of expression, freedom of speech. Something bad happens in the country, information flows immediately. Even at the time when we didn't have this electronic social media, we had the normal media, print media, the television beginning and the radio. So even that media was enough. If they had enough freedom to express and disseminate news, any indication of an emerging famine gets immediately transmitted as common knowledge to everyone. And as that knowledge goes to those who govern, the rulers, they take note, because famines is such a traumatic experience that no ruler wants famine in their country. They can tolerate underdevelopment, they can tolerate various kinds of injustice and lack of freedom. No government in a democratic country can tolerate as traumatic an experience as famine. So they would immediately take actions to prevent a famine. But if you have a totalitarian country where there is no freedom of expression, freedom of news, freedom of speech, as he gave the example of China in the days of Mao Zedong's great leap forward and the Cultural Revolution. At that time, China suffered from one of the deepest and biggest famines in its history because nobody told them. Government was not aware of them. The top level of the rulers were not aware of them because nobody told them. Nobody told them because nobody dared told them. Why nobody dared told them? Because they knew that if anybody wanted to say it, that person will be persecuted. There was no freedom. So it is the lack of freedom, freedom of speech, freedom of expression that precipitated that monumental famine in the late 1950s, early 1960s in China, in which millions of innocent Chinese died. Lack of freedom can be lethal in literal sense. And that same thing expired in recent history about COVID. COVID has devastated the world, not only in terms of immediate diseases and deaths, but also because of its long-term effect on global recession, which has stymied the development effort of many countries in the world. And why did this COVID take this massive dimension as it did? Diseases have appeared before. Not always they have been so disastrous. And the last one was the influenza epidemic of more than a century ago. It happened because when COVID was spreading in a small locality, nobody had the courage to talk about it. And nobody had the courage because they knew that they have no right, no freedom to give this information. They will be persecuted if they did. And it is this fact that the knowledge information did not move upward, that nobody took any action at that time. By the time action was taken, it was all out in the world. So the devastation that you see today, not only in terms of immediate loss of lives, but economic devastation through the recession that followed the COVID, is fundamentally a consequence of lack of freedom. It's not lack of judgment, not lack of medicine. It's not lack of vaccines. It's lack of freedom that has devastated the world. And this devastation has been suffered not just the world as a whole. It is being suffered by China itself, not only in the short term. It's also going to suffer in the long term. Recently, an economist, Adam Posen, wrote a paper called The End of China's Economic Miracle, published in the journal Foreign Affairs in August this year, 2023. He argued that how the experience of COVID had a negative consequence on China's economy, whose effect is going to persist for a long, long time. He says, with arguments and evidence, that the experience of COVID has made the Chinese people realize that they cannot trust their leaders to make their best judgments about the society, about the economy, about anything. And this lack of trust in the ability and the competence of the rulers, they cannot express in those terms. They are not allowed to do that. But they can express it in their action. Action in what they are doing. They're expressing it by being cautious in their economic activities. They're holding back. They're saving instead of spending money. They're holding back their investments. Savings have come down. Investment has come down. These are other reasons too. But Adam Poston says this is an additional reason which has brought down savings and investment in China, which has brought down their growth far below what they had achieved in the recent past. And he argues that this is going to persist for a long, long time. And this economic meltdown is not entirely a meltdown, but by China's lofty standards, the current growth rate is a huge, huge fall. And that fall, he explains, to a large extent because of this lack of freedom. So justice and lack of freedom, injustice and lack of freedom are not just bad in themselves. They're bad for our economic performance as well. Having made these arguments, I now want to turn to our implications of all this for our development strategy. Now, although I have argued that all three goals, development, justice, and freedom, must be pursued simultaneously, one might still raise a question about the issue of trade-off that often arises in any strategy. Given that policymakers' time, skills, and competence and other resources are limited, there is inevitably some trade-off among them. Paying more attention to some of them necessarily entails paying less attention to others. So one might ask, to which of these three goals they should pay more attention while pursuing them simultaneously, if they do need to make trade-offs? 5 minutes. Yeah. No, thank you. Oh, thank you. So the question must be asked, if they need to make a trade-off, they may be persuaded to pursue them simultaneously, as I've argued, but even while pursuing them simultaneously, there could be a question of what is the relative importance I attach to one goal rather than the others. My answer to that question is they should give more emphasis on justice and freedom and less on development. I say this not because I think development is any less important than the other two. To me, they're all equally important. The reason I say this is based on a notion of what might be called the domain of competence. There is a public domain which is managed by the government and its various institutions. And there is a private domain which is managed by the people directly, either individually or in small groups. For certain tasks, the public domain is more competent. For certain other tasks, the private domain is more competent. Now, considering which domain is more competent to deal with the three valuable objects that you are talking about today, my view is that justice and freedom fall more in the public domain of competence and development more in the private domain of competence. Why should development be more in the private domain? Think about development in the conventional sense. It means growth of output, national output. Who creates this output? This output is created mostly by the multitude of individuals working in different spheres of the economy, either singly or collectively in small groups, which you call firms, companies, enterprises. So if economic development does happen, it happens out of the labor and intellect of the people. Therefore, contrary to remarks we sometimes hear that the government and sometimes the supreme leader of the government sometimes claim that we have delivered development. Don't you believe this? Government does not deliver development. It is people who deliver development. The government at best facilitates it, at worst spoils it. In short, development is an activity that occurs mainly in the private domain. In contrast, justice and freedom that we need to establish at the societal level cannot be easily delivered by the people working in the private domain. As political philosophers have long argued, most notably by John Rawls, carefully constructed institutions are needed to ensure social justice. The same argument can be made about freedom. Now, the creation and maintenance of those institutions, as well as achieving compliance with them, requires a degree of coordination that would be impossible to achieve in the private domain. And that is because of the problems that economists would be, and political scientists too, would be familiar with, the problems, the free rider problem, problems of the prisoner's dilemma type, which lead to suboptimal outcomes when people try to achieve social goals through private initiatives. Now, philosophers like to describe these problems as a conflict between passion and reason. Passion is a human faculty that is more self-regarding, self-oriented, although passion can sometimes be other-regarding too. But reason is the faculty that is more capable of being other-regarding by transcending the self. Now, by their very nature, justice and freedom are other-regarding concepts. They are not self-regarding concepts. As such, they should be guided more by reason than by passion. But the problem is that left to their own devices, people often find that passion overwhelms reason. The self-regarding motive triumphs over other-regarding motive. That's why it's difficult to establish justice and freedom primarily through the private domain. Only some authority operating above the individual level can, in principle, ensure that reason triumphs over passion. Therefore, the responsibility of meeting the needs of justice and freedom must reside in the public domain primarily. Of course, by saying that the task of ensuring justice and freedom should be primarily in the public domain, and the task of development should be primarily in the private domain, I am not saying that government doesn't have any role to play in development. Of course it has. But its role is mainly a supportive one. It doesn't deliver, but it can support. Traditionally, the government supportive role has been recognized, but it has been interpreted too narrowly to include a small range of tasks, such as providing public goods, maintaining law and order, and ensuring macroeconomic stability. My analysis suggests that this view must be broadened to include the further tasks of ensuring justice and freedom as well, because as I have argued, they too support development. To conclude, the gist of my argument can be stated only at a slight exaggeration as follows. If the government takes care of justice and freedom, people will take care of development. To put it slightly differently, let the government take care of justice and freedom, development will take care of itself. Therefore, if governments have to assign priorities, they should prioritize justice and freedom over development. That's where their domain of, that's where their competence lies. Sadly, in most parts of the world, the opposite happens to be true. Most governments in the developing world in particular are obsessed with development in the conventional sense. My argument implies that if they really value development, they should instead be obsessed with justice and freedom. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Osmani, for a very illuminating speech and analytically framed and having a, a deeper implications for what and how we think about development in the present day. So normally development is associated with economic development, with production of, with the production approach, with productivity approach, but the hidden links between development, justice, and freedom have been revealed in Professor Osmani's speech. He mentioned several channels: credit constraint channel, the channel of gender justice, channel of social stability, and how it affects development itself. So he was today mostly emphasizing on the instrumental links between development and justice and freedom. On the other hand, he mentioned towards the end of his speech that development can be relegated, in a sense, following Adam Smith, to the private domain, because it is the economic actors who produces development. Government only facilitates by providing a coordinating role. But on the other hand, justice and freedom demands separate construction of institutions. He mentioned about roles advocating careful construction of justice institutions. We can think about careful construction of a democratic institution. For instance, a debate has been lingering on for some time in our country as well, whether we should be having a representative democracy or proportional representation-based democracy, like in Nordic countries. All the Nordic countries, as you know, including New Zealand, pursue a system of proportional representation-based democracy. So these are issues of social choices, and where the role of government becomes critical. So we have about 25 minutes, 25 minutes for question and answer session from the floor to be addressed to Professor Osmani following his lecture. And after that, we'll have around 25 minutes to 30 minutes for important deliberations by our chief guest and special guests, whom we would love to hear on this very topical subject. So I will open the floor both to this audience and to the Zoom, and those who are joining us through the Zoom links. Please raise hand in the Zoom, and also from the floor. Dr. Ashikur Rahman. Please give your introduction, because we are recording it for our website, and after that, Dr. Saiduzaman.
Thank you. I'm Ashikur Rahman from Policy Research Institute. I thank Professor Osmani for his very coherent, very nicely analytically structured speech, and it's a theoretical speech which I respect from an intrinsic point of view. But I wonder whether, when we make such connections between such fundamentally important topics, should the theory be based on economic history? Because if we look at economic history of slave trade by UK, the Opium Wars of UK, the Chinese transformation, the Meiji Japan transformation, and all the economic history of development and how we see that these ideas never kind of happened at once in any political journey or social journey of any nation state. It makes it harder to support that nation state should first prioritize what he kind of argued for, which is justice and freedom, and later development. But rather, I think economic history validates that nation states has given priority to the idea of material well-being, and the higher ideas of justice and freedom has followed. So I want to know whether whether the argument he's making is, I agree from an idealist point of view, maybe that is meaningful, but whether his arguments have are supported by economic history. Thank you.
Take a few more questions. Mr. Saidul. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Birack. First of all, I must say that I'm not a doctor. I am Mr. Saidul. I would like to congratulate Dr. Osmani for his excellent speech, but I missed two things. One is the idea of equity. Perhaps it is included in the idea of justice. But one thing that I missed very strongly is the issue of good governance. I expected you to bring in the concept of good governance in all these ideas of development, justice, and freedom. Thank you.
Professor Moinul Hasan.
Thank you, Binayak. Although I missed a good part of Siddiq's lecture, I wonder whether he would allow that the enabling role of the state in delivering development, so to speak, can be different for a developmental country or developmental context than in a more mature economy. I mean, the role of public capital with law and order, the market failure, and building institutions, these are much larger responsibilities in a developmental context than in a more mature economy. So whether you think you see a difference there or not. Thank you.
Dr. Helal from North-South University, Professor J. Food, Dr. M.M. Akash, and then Dr. Julfikar.
Thank you, Professor Hilal Ahmed, North-South University. Thank you very much for a very enlightening keynote speech. I would like to pick up from from your last statement or assertion, let the government take care of justice and freedom, and people will take care of development. And then I think the role of functional institutions were highlighted by the chair of this session. So let me, if I may, start with this, the ABCD. When I first come across this acronym, I think it was a movie, which is like American-born confused deshis. And when my children were born in Australia, I thought probably I will adopt it for Australian context. So the C for confusion stuck with me. I know here C is for a conference. Now, why I'm saying that is because we have been going through a crisis, economic crisis, and there is an astonishing silence from the policymakers to engage, to talk about it, engage the stakeholders in this, because perception is the reality, and it's everybody's business to know where we are heading to. So this conference is a very welcome development event in that context, and I'm thankful for that. Now, functional institutions. I know it's people business for development, but the government institutions, functions, set the ecosystem in which development takes place. And so economic governance, if we are to improve that, we have to do institutional innovations as well. I know our keynote speaker suggested policy making in the darkness of night. And I also heard that India develops when bureaucrats sleep at night. So basically, it has to be a public engagement. My point is institutional innovation is important. And I'm thinking that if you are to change policy making in the darkness of night, we have to take the policymakers into account. And one innovations I would like to propose, and I would like to hear your views on that, is should we change or expand the remit of Planning Commission to undertake, regulatory impact assessment, engagement of, various stakeholders, and I think BIDS is in a perfect position to undertake that role, and they should be professionally independent. Their authority should be defended by law so that they can undertake policy reviews. Any new policies should be assessed on the basis of their economic merits, looked into direct and indirect effects and all sorts of things, unwarranted effects. So my question to the, should we do, this is the crisis we are going through, we shouldn't let it go. We should take this crisis to do institutional innovations, and should planning commissions should be transitioned into some authority which can undertake that responsibility of policy debate, engagement, and taking policymakers into account. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Rood. You can be heard.
Can you hear this?
Yeah.
You can hear. Okay, thank you. I've listened to 2 lectures this year. The 2 best lectures I've listened to this year, and they've both been given by Professor Osmani. So thank you very much. I'm being well educated, and I admire your thinking. But I have a but. And it starts with your opening remark about development residing in economics. If we consider that development also resides in political economy and the, if I may say, the anthropology of political economy, then it seems to me that the structure of the argument changes. And I'll jump to, as it were, the conclusion about this, which is to think very differently about how people interact with each other and the extent to which they can be, all of them, responsible for development, which it seems to me in the argument relies upon an illusion of equality as a function or precondition of democracy. So it seems to me that the argument is problematic because of the sequence of assumptions. And I can illustrate that really, if I dare to do so in this setting, by offering a slight critique of Amartya Sen. Because it seems to me that the capabilities argument that he's advanced, which joins these things together, development, justice, and freedom, is insufficiently dealing with political economy, the anthropology of political economy or sociology. And one way I try to capture that is to take the phrase the security of agency rather than the notion of capabilities. Because once you start advancing the idea of the security of agency, you are immediately placing it within the problematic of the political economy, and indeed the anthropology of that, in recognizing, of course, that people's freedoms and justice are constrained not just in relation to the state, but they're constrained in relation to other people around them in a hostile political economy.
We are approaching the crunch time. So last question in this cycle is Professor Akash.
Thank you. I just missed the large part of Professor Osmani's lecture and started to listen it from the last few sentences. And in the last sentence, you presented an exaggerated claim. And my question relates to that. Firstly, can we assume that politics and economics are two independent variables, or whether they are endogenous within your model? One determines the other and other determines the other reciprocally. If that is so, then there can be a mutual equilibrium between bad politics and bad economics. From the criteria of freedom and justice. If elites dominate the private domain and they send their representatives to the parliament and they dominate the politics, then how state can deliver justice and freedom, or how private sector can do efficiently in the market? So how this equilibrium under crony capitalism can be broken? Thank you.
Osmani bhai, you have many questions and we have limited time.
Thank you very much for all your questions and comments and criticisms. Sadly, the answer to all these questions are not within my domain of competence, many of them. So I won't be able to probably do justice to all of them, but I can try. I think, Ashikur Rahman, I perhaps failed to express myself clearly. What you are saying is true, that historically speaking, governments around the world did not prioritize justice and freedom. And it's not just historically true in the sense of in the past, it's also in the present. I'm not saying that. I do say that in the developed countries in the world, we see people prioritizing development and neglecting justice and freedom. So what you say about historically is true. I do accept. But I didn't say the opposite. I didn't say that you reverse the historical practice and focus on justice and freedom now and take care of development later. This sequence I did not accept, did not suppose. My position has been that you need to do all of them simultaneously. But when you do certain things simultaneously, you still need to prioritize about which one you have to give more attention, which one you have to give less attention. So it's not a question of now or later. The issue is about now, simultaneously pursuing, prioritize. My argument, right or wrong, my argument is when you pursue simultaneously, government should give more attention to justice and freedom, less to development, because development can be taken care of people. Justice and freedom cannot be taken care of by the people on their own. That was the reason, but it's not a question of now and later. That was not my point at all. Mr. Saiduzaman বলেছেন he missed two items, equity and good governance, and I think this list can be extended. If you think about it, there are many other things I also omitted, partly because you cannot address everything at the same time. Here's another case of trade-off. You have to prioritize what you want to emphasize. But actually, if you had the time to elaborate, those things can be brought into the discussion. The equity is very much related to the concept of justice They're not identical, but closely related. We can discuss them. But the underlying concern with justice and underlying concern with equity are fundamentally the same. So it was not really missed. It was there, but slightly hidden from the gaze, public gaze. And good governance, similarly, is there implicitly because what I said about government not being able to do the things properly, not only in terms of economic efficiency, but also taking the right decisions in the absence of freedom of speech, freedom of expression, applies very much to good governance as well. Good governance cannot be left simply to the goodwill of those who govern. They have to be put under pressure so that they govern well. And that pressure has to come through freedom of opinion, freedom of expression, freedom of speech, what I call deliberative democracy and public reasoning. So that is the relevance where that is the mechanism through which the idea of good governance also comes in. Mainul Hassan has made a important point that when I say what is the role of government, of course, the precise remit of government enabling role would definitely vary from not only countries at different stages of development, but within the same stage in different countries, depending on their particular circumstances. But we shall have to work out what those tasks are in a particular context. But I want to make a general point as a matter of principle about where should government give more emphasis rather than less. But then exactly how you operationalize that emphasis, of course, would depend on country context and the stage of development context. And I also agree with what Professor Hilal Ahmed said about accountability. But accountability can be established only in a system where you have the ability to hold them accountable. And that ability cannot exist if I cannot say what I want to say. How would I hold someone accountable if I cannot tell him what wrong he has done, what I think, what wrong he or she has done? So in order, accountability's prior requirement is this freedom, and the freedom to have the opportunity for deliberative democracy and to have this forum of public reasoning. Without that, you cannot hold anybody accountable. So I agree with you, but I was talking about the prior condition that we need to establish in order for that to be possible. Jeffrey Wood made some very important points. And if I wanted, even if I had the competence to deal with all of them, I couldn't do it possibly do it in the time that is available to me. I'll just make two statements which may sound more like assertions than arguments, simply because I don't have the time to go into details. First of all, when I said development resides in the realm of economics, first of all, I meant development in the conventional sense, economic growth, which is most people, even including most of our policymakers, understand it. That conventional development in the conventional sense, because it deals with growth of economic output. For that particular reason, I put it in the realm of economics. But when I put it in the realm of economics, I don't mean it lives an isolated life in economics. None of my three categories, when I say economic development is in economics, justice is in ethics, and freedom is in politics, I don't mean they live an isolated, cocooned life in their respective domains. It's an intellectual device to think about, say, permanent residence. You and I, Jeffrey and I, move around the world, we go to different places, but we have something called permanent residence. So I was more thinking about in terms of that permanent, not primary, but primary residence of this concept. That's how I thought about them. So, but of course, they're all related to each other, and development certainly belongs in the domain of political economy, anthropology, others. So there's no denying that conceptually. But you had a more substantive question. That point was, if we recognize that their residence, primary or otherwise, extends beyond economics into political economy, anthropology, etc., does it make any difference to the sequence of my arguments? That's the most substantive point you made, and I thank you very much for making that point. When I write up the paper, I shall think more about it. But my immediate point is, I do not actually believe that it leads me astray. And even when I use the Amartya Sen's framework of capability approach, I do not think that approach prohibits me or impedes me in some way into taking account of the considerations that you made. Now, if you emphasize the security of agency, if there is, for whatever reason, it hampers the security of the agency of the people, it does have an implication for the capability of that person. Capability of the person in the broadest sense is whether the person is able to choose and implement and execute the kind of life that person values. If I do not have security of in fact, they're very closely related to each other. A lot of the discussions that Amartya Sen has and others have on capability approach, agency and capability go hand in hand with each other in that discussion. Akash, of course, you made a very perfectly valid point, and if elites dominate either the public sphere or the private sphere, if either of the spheres is dominated by a small segment of the population, elite or otherwise, it cannot deliver what they're supposed to deliver. So when I say that justice and freedom remain primarily in the domain of public domain and development in the private domain, I didn't mean that public domain will always be able to deliver justice and freedom. I didn't mean the private domain will always be able to deliver development. What I say that if anybody has to deliver it, justice and freedom have to be delivered in the public domain. If anybody has to deliver it, development must be delivered primarily in the private domain. If anybody has to deliver it, there is no guarantee that they will be able to deliver it. And the kind of problems that you have mentioned will be impediments to delivery. And then we have to go to next level of discussion. What can you do to deal with those impediments that obviously exist in the implementation of our respective task in the respective domain? So that will be the next step of the discussion. I think you will be better. That will be more in your domain of competence than mine. So I leave it to you. Thank you.
Okay, I think Dr. Julfikar, if you pardon. So then Dr. Sajid Amin, that's the last question from the floor, and then we'll go to our dignitaries.
So my question, I think, follows on a couple of the other questions that were raised. Thank you very much. This was excellent. I learned a lot, so I'm not speaking from any kind of position of expertise, but simply to ask, to what extent are these notions bound by the concept of the nation state? And if they are not, then what is the role of agents outside of the nation state? And in particular, I'm thinking of all of the efforts, all of the money that goes into the UN system and others. Where do they come in, and do they come in at all? And I'd like you to reflect a little bit on that in the context of decolonization.
Once again, a very good question, but a question that I'm unable to answer fully here, or maybe not at all. What you rightly said is, when I discuss this is the activity in the private domain, this is the activity in the public domain, obviously I'm referring to within the context of a nation state. But as you are rightly pointing out, nation state doesn't live in isolation. In the modern world, in the increasingly globalized world, nations interact with each other in many different ways. So those interactions will have to be brought in mind, kept in mind, while implementing what I said needs to be implemented in different domains. You can think of it as a follow-up to the question raised by Akash. To say that this activity in domain A and this activity in domain B do not necessarily mean that domain A can actually do it and domain B can actually do that. They may not be able to do that. I place them in their domain because that's where their intrinsic competence lies. But that doesn't mean they're able to do it. And one of the reasons they may not be able to do it is the effect of those international interconnections. Some of those interconnections may be conducive to the fulfillment of those tasks, and some of those other interconnections may be inimical to the fulfillment of this task. So when you go to the next step, as I was discussing with Akash, so if they are within these domains, how can these domains perform better? When you ask that second stage question, that's why your issue will come up again, just as the issues of Akash came up. Thank you.
Sorry, with Osmani Bhai's permission, I'll take another. You can answer from the platform from Dr. Kaji Iqbal.
Just one quick question, can't resist myself. Okay, suppose government has a perfect mechanism to aggregate social preference, the public preference, and government, and they learn that this is the order that the people prefer. They prefer development first, then justice, then freedom. Then if this is the case, then what should government do?
If we are saying the government aggregated the preferences in this order of preference, I would then say, well, I have not been able to convince the people. Because in my argument, there is no ordering of importance among justice, freedom, and development. I started from the presumption and ended with the presumption that all of them are equally valuable. So in my view, it was not an aggregation of preferences over the three. It's a question of prioritization, not in terms, as I was saying, in replying to Ashik, prioritization not in terms of which one do first, which I do second, which I do third. That's not, it's a sequential ordering, not either. It's neither an ordering in terms of importance, nor a sequencing in terms of ordering. It's a question of when you do give equal importance to all of them, try to simultaneously pursue them. Where should different parts of the society specialize? My argument is that in this case, the public domain should specialize in justice and freedom, and private domain should specialize in for the development. Recognizing the specialization doesn't mean that that's the only one, is the only he or that party is responsible. Others are responsibility, but it's the primary task is what identified. So if people believe differently, if they think that between justice, freedom, and development, there's an ordering that government needs to aggregate, then I have failed in my mission. Thank you.